My name is John, and I live with my father, Michael, in a small town in the eastern United States. Our family consists of just the two of us, Dad and me, because my mom died when I was very young. Her name was Sarah, and she was the kindest and most loving person in the world. Dad often told me how they met in college and fell in love at first sight. Their relationship was a real fairy tale. They went on dates together, laughed, and dreamed about the future. After graduating, they got married and decided to settle down in our quiet town to raise children in a peaceful environment. For Mom, family was the meaning of life. She adored Dad and dreamed of the day when they would have children. Unfortunately, she couldn't get pregnant, and the years went by. My parents had almost given up hope, but then a miracle happened. Mom found out she was pregnant with me. It was the happiest time of their lives, and they were literally glowing with joy. However, complications arose during childbirth. Mom lost a lot of blood and fell into a coma. The doctors did everything they could, but her condition only deteriorated. 2 weeks later, she died without regaining consciousness. For Dad, it was a real blow. He lost the love of his life at the happiest moment. I was just a tiny baby and don't remember anything about Mom. But Dad told me about her, showed me photos where she beamed with a happy smile. I grew up knowing that she was watching over me from heaven, and I had to strive to be a good son so as not to disappoint her. It was a very difficult time for Dad. Every day, he blamed himself for not being able to protect Mom and the baby. He had to cope with grief while raising me alone. But he was a real hero. He worked late to provide for us, and on weekends, he devoted himself entirely to me, playing, going for walks, and creating happy memories. Dad never remarried. His heart belonged only to Mom. Sometimes women in the town showed interest in him, but he politely refused, saying he had already found his one true love. I was his whole world, his gift from Sarah, and he dedicated his life to me to make up for the absence of a mother. Dad and I went through a lot together, but our bond only grew stronger. He is the most wonderful father in the world, my hero and best friend. And I always strive to be a good son, worthy of the memory of the loving mother I never knew. This is our sad but beautiful story, and I will be grateful to my parents until the end of my days. Life without Mom was not easy, but Dad and I learned to find joy in simple things. Every day, he tried to create a happy childhood for me, no matter what. On weekends, we would get up early and cook breakfast together, Dad's famous pancakes with maple syrup. Then we would go play in the park, swing on the swings, race each other, or just lie on the grass and watch the clouds. Dad always knew how to cheer me up with his funny stories and jokes. In the evenings, we would sit by the fireplace and read books aloud or watch old comedies together on TV. Dad was a true master storyteller. He could spend hours engagingly talking about his childhood, adventures, or historical events. I could listen to him endlessly. As I grew up, our shared interests changed. As a teenager, we would argue at length about literature and philosophy, sharing our views on life. Dad patiently listened to my youthful ideals and helped me look at things from different angles. Our relationship became more of a friendship than a father-son bond. I learned so much from Dad: hard work, perseverance, optimism. He set an example for me of how to handle difficult situations and not give up. At school, I had problems with boys who bullied me because I didn't have a mother. But Dad explained that there would always be obstacles in life and taught me not to pay attention to foolishness. Dad devoted himself entirely to me, working multiple jobs to ensure I had everything I needed. He never complained and always found time to be there for me. Our weekends remained sacred when all the parks and museums in town had been thoroughly explored. Together, we went through important milestones of growing up: the first day of school, first love, graduation. Dad was my biggest ally and support. He only wanted the best for me and believed that I would succeed. By the time I went to college, we had become not only father and son, but also best friends. Dad hugged me goodbye with tears in his eyes and told me how proud he was of me. I vowed to always be there for him and to carry on the name of our family with dignity. Every few months, I would come home for the weekends, and we would return to our traditions: long nighttime conversations, watching old movies, reminiscing about Mom. Dad gently encouraged me to pursue new relationships, but I still wasn't ready to let anyone else into our family. He and Mom were the only true love for me. The years went by. Our unbreakable bond only grew stronger. Despite the distances and life's twists and turns, Dad remained my closest person, an ideal man and main support. And I tried to live up to his high expectations and be a reliable son, supporting and protecting him in return. Our life without Mom was not easy, but we always had each other, two halves of a whole. And that was the most important thing. I had just come home for the weekend from college when I noticed that Dad was acting strangely. He was distracted during our conversations, constantly glancing at his phone, and in the evenings, he was out late instead of spending time at home. At first, I didn't suspect anything. Who knows what could have happened at work. But after a couple of days, I casually remarked, "Hey, Dad, is something going on? You seem distracted lately." Dad clearly looked flustered and hesitated before answering. "Everything's fine, son. It's just, well, do you remember Jake from the repair shop? He suggested I try this dating app." My jaw dropped. Dad and dating? It was so unusual to hear. He had gone his whole life without romantic relationships after Mom's death. But now, looking at his slightly shy demeanor, I realized Dad was starting a new chapter. "And how is it going? Have you met anyone?" I mumbled, trying to hide my astonishment. Dad nodded and smiled faintly. "Yeah, there's this one woman. Her name is Lucy. We've been chatting for a couple of weeks. And, well, she seems all right." I couldn't believe my ears. My 70-year-old father had an online romance? It was so modern and totally not his style. But I decided not to show it and to be supportive. "That's great, Dad," I exclaimed, patting him on the shoulder. "I'm glad you decided to try something new. Tell me about her." And Dad seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. He enthusiastically began describing Lucy, her interests, character, profession. From his beaming expression, I could tell she really appealed to him. Perhaps a sincere, youthful romance was blossoming in his life again. The next day, Dad rushed off to meet Lucy, grumbling and brushing off my teasing remarks. I sat for a couple of hours, looking at old photos with Mom and trying to imagine their reaction. What would she say if she saw us now? I decided she would be happy for Dad. After all, it had been so long. Closer to evening, Dad returned in high spirits. He and Lucy had spent several hours at a cafe, chatting about everything under the sun. Dad was glowing with happiness, for the first time in a long while. His former shyness was gone. He kept beaming as he recalled their conversation. "She's so wonderful, Johnny," he shared with me. "Smart, well-read, a delightful conversationalist. And her character is just right, confident but not rude." Dad was positively radiant as he described her virtues. That evening, we sat up late discussing Dad's new romance. I tried to hide my puzzlement after so many years without a woman in his life. It was all so unusual. But at the same time, I was happy for him. Dad deserved to find someone who could warm his heart. He had been alone for too long. A couple of days later, it was time for me to return to college. Before leaving, Dad hugged me tightly and solemnly said, "It's not serious yet, son, but who knows what the future holds. In any case, Lucy has brought new colors into my life. So remember that name." As I left our small town, I pondered the changes happening in my father's life. Would he find a new life companion in Lucy? Could I accept the presence of a stranger in our family? Thoughts swarmed, and an inexplicable, vague fear of impending events arose in my soul. I loved my father and wished him happiness. But at the same time, I didn't want anything to change in our special, unique bond. Difficult times lay ahead. During one of my visits home, he sat at the kitchen table with a gloomy expression. Clasping his hands, Dad said, "Son, I need to tell you something. Lucy and we've decided she'll move in with us." My breath caught. My home, my haven, was suddenly supposed to be filled with the presence of a stranger. This news was like a bolt from the blue for me. "Why?" I blurted, not hiding my surprise. "Doesn't she have her own home? Won't it be too cramped for the three of us here?" Dad smiled sadly and tried to take my hand, but I shrugged my shoulder. "It's not that simple, John. Lucy recently lost her job, and her apartment is in terrible condition. I can't let her live like that, and our feelings have become serious. He drained his glass of water in one gulp before continuing. Anyway, we discussed it and decided it would be better if Lucy moved in with us. At least for a while, until things improve. For a moment, a deathly silence hung in the room. I stared intently at Dad, but I couldn't detect the usual warmth and confidence in his eyes. It seemed he doubted this decision himself, but stubbornly refused to back down. But this is our home, I protested. Our personal space, a place where we can relax and be ourselves. How can this woman, whom we hardly know, suddenly become part of our lives? The words flowed freely, increasingly filled with bitterness and disappointment. Dad shook his head helplessly, trying to calm me. When Lucy appeared on the doorstep 2 weeks later, I immediately took a dislike to her. She was Dad's age, with a tired face and disheveled gray hair. Her rumpled outfit hung carelessly on her scrawny figure, and her gaze radiated a mixture of defiance and suspicion. Dropping a couple of battered suitcases in the hallway, Lucy cast a fleeting glance around our living room. Her lips curled contemptuously as she examined the family photos and Dad's knickknacks. I froze in the doorway, watching in disbelief as this strange woman invaded our lives. Her manners exuded disdain, as if Dad's house was too small and humble for her. Well, I guess I'll have to settle in, she muttered instead of a greeting, staring at me with an hostile gaze. Instinctively, I stepped closer to Dad, feeling the need to protect him and our home from this arrogant woman. He looked around helplessly, biting his lips. It seemed only now was it dawning on him what a mistake he had made. From that moment on, our peaceful, measured life collapsed in an instant. The house filled with quarrels and Lucy's grumbling, who was never satisfied with anything. Either she didn't like how I left my things lying around, or she criticized Dad's cooking. Her presence disrupted the familiar routine that had reigned here for years. The atmosphere became increasingly oppressive and tense. Dad seemed to shrink before my eyes, apologizing meekly and currying favor with Lucy. And only on me did he cast silent apologies and pleas for help. Often I spent nights at friends' houses, unable to bear another round of criticism and reproaches. I only returned home to spend an hour or two alone with Dad when Lucy went out on errands. Only then did he relax, and his eyes regained their warm, familiar glow. Don't pay any attention to her, son, he whispered. Someday, everything will work out and be like before. She just needs to get used to it here. She needs our support. Deep down, I desperately didn't want, like before, to mean Lucy's permanent presence in our lives. But for Dad's sake, I remained silent, suppressing my irritation. It was his life, his choice. And although every instinct screamed that it was a mistake, I tried to accept his decision. Watching our close father-son bond crumble, I felt anger and disappointment boiling up inside me. Lucy seemed to be throwing rocks into our little world, shattering the prevailing harmony. And with each of her negative words, each sneer, it became harder for me to remain calm. A sticky fear settled in my soul that my relationship with Dad would never be the same. That this woman would forever change our lives and take away my only close person. Months dragged on in an atmosphere of constant tension and misunderstanding. Every day in our home was a test of endurance for all of us. Lucy seemed intent on turning our lives into hell with her grumbling disposition and caustic comments. She nitpicked everything from the clutter in the living room to Dad's burnt dinner. Her whining and complaining never ceased for a minute. Dad seemed to shrink before my eyes, becoming more withdrawn and depressed. He kept asking me for forgiveness with a shy, guilty look, as if apologizing for this whole nightmare. And sometimes he cast pleading glances at me, begging for patience and support. I tried to remain steadfast, but inside I was seething with anger and disappointment. Our home, once filled with coziness and love, had turned into a battlefield where Lucy reigned supreme. Her word was law, and our attempts to object were invariably cut short by another outburst of rage. At times, I seriously feared our relationship with Dad wouldn't withstand this pressure. It seemed the chasm between us grew wider with each passing day. Sometimes he became so withdrawn that I couldn't break through that stony wall of silence. Wistfully, I thought of bygone times when our home was a territory of happiness. When on Sundays, we would linger into the night, discussing books and movies. When we enjoyed breakfasts in peace and quiet. Where had all that gone? Lucy's brashness seemed to have displaced all the joyful moments from our lives. Naturally, we quarreled with her constantly. As soon as I returned from college for the holidays, a new battle would begin between us. Lucy would lash out with insults and nitpicking, accusing me of every deadly sin from leaving socks lying around to making noise moving around the house. In those moments, rage would boil up inside me, and I would respond with an angry retort. How dare she treat me like that in my own home? How dare she disrupt our well-established routine with her ambitions and whims? Sometimes our squabble escalated to shouting, and then Dad would intervene, begging us both to stop. With pain in his eyes, he would look at us and ask how it had come to this. More than once or twice, I threatened to leave home, unable to tolerate Lucy and her antics any longer. But Dad held me back, assuring me that everything would work out eventually, it just needed time. "Bear with me, son, I beg you," he would repeat, taking my hand in his, and I would grit my teeth and nod, promising to restrain myself. For his sake, for the memory of Mom and all the happy years in our home. For the faint hope that someday Lucy would come to her senses and everything would return to how it was before. Although with each passing month, I believed in it less and less. And then one day, Dad came home agitated. He paced around the living room, rubbing his palms, and upon noticing me, he exhaled. "Johnny, I need to tell you something. I proposed to Lucy, and she said yes." The world swam before my eyes. Marriage? They decided to formalize their relationship, letting Lucy into our family permanently and irrevocably. Anger mingled with despair flared up inside me. Was Dad so blinded that he couldn't see what a vile woman he had brought into our home? Didn't he understand how much grief and discord she had caused these past months? "But Dad, are you sure?" I gasped. "After everything that's happened? After so many quarrels and insults? How can you decide on this?" Dad bowed his head and slumped his shoulders. He was on the verge of tears at my words. "Son, I know. It hasn't been easy, and Lucy is a complicated person. But she loves me, and I love her. And she agreed to become my wife. It means so much." I couldn't believe my ears. My father, the closest and dearest person to me, was dissolving into this woman before my very eyes. And instead of objecting, disputing his wrongful decision, I merely shrugged my shoulders helplessly. That evening, we didn't say another word to each other. Dad looked so happy and helpless at the same time. And I just looked at him and waited for the veil to be lifted from his eyes. When he would realize he was making a terrible mistake. Unfortunately, that never happened. The wedding preparations went into full swing, although I tried my best to ignore this fact. Every day at dinner, Lucy and Dad discussed flowers, outfits, guests, and with each word, my heart grew heavier. On the appointed day, I gritted my teeth, put on a tuxedo, and trudged to the nearest chapel. Close friends and neighbors had already gathered there, casting sympathetic glances my way. It seemed everyone could see how much I was against this marriage. But could a mere son dissuade a stubborn father? The wedding passed in a haze. I could barely breathe watching Dad utter vows of love and fidelity. Seeing him slip the ring onto Lucy's ringless finger, this spiteful witch. The scene in the chapel unfolded like a waking nightmare. Dad held Lucy's hand, solemnly vowing love and loyalty. And she smiled happily at him, rejoicing in triumph. Every word burned me from within, reminding me how strongly I was against this marriage. Against Lucy officially becoming part of our family. I looked at her and saw a cruel, selfish woman who was merely using Dad for her own benefit. In that moment, something primal, instinctive boiled up inside me. Anger and fury drowned out all rational arguments. I couldn't let this happen. I couldn't allow this witch to destroy everything Dad and I had. Leaping from the bench, I screamed at the top of my lungs. "Stop! Don't you dare do this!" People gasped, and Dad turned with a stunned expression. But I could no longer contain myself. "Dad, get away from her!" I roared, clutching his sleeve. "Don't you see what's happening? She's been crippling our lives ever since she moved in. Lucy is destroying everything we had." The priest indignantly rattled on about the sanctity of the rite, and the guests whispered in shock. But I no longer cared. "She's a vile egoist to whom you and I mean nothing." I spat through clenched fists. She only wants to ensnare you to secure a comfortable life for herself. Is that what you want, Dad? Tears choked me. But I forced myself to speak these awful words. Because they were the truth. Blinded by infatuation, Dad failed to see Lucy's true nature. Her malice, greed, and cruelty. Lucy shrieked and collapsed onto the bench in a faint, clutching her heart. I looked with disgust at this cheap theatrics. How she portrayed the sweet victim, when everyone knew what a hurricane she had caused at home. But Dad stood frozen like a pillar of salt. His face contorted with anguish, his eyes dimmed. It seemed, deep down, he understood I was right. But the thought of letting his one true love in old age slip away was unbearable. Minutes ticked by in deathly silence. Then Dad opened his mouth and said barely audibly, "Forgive me, son. I seem to have made a huge mistake." And dropping Lucy onto the bench, he unclenched his fingers, releasing her hand. She crumpled into a ball and burst into loud sobs. But I didn't even glance at her. Embracing Dad by the shoulders, I held him tightly to me. We stood like that, our faces buried in each other's chests. Dad trembled, but it seemed he had finally seen the light. I had saved him from a life of nightmare. That night, for the first time in many months, we spoke freely heart to heart. Dad confessed everything: his blindness, his fear of loneliness, his desire for love. I consoled and supported him as best I could, rejoicing that this nightmare was finally over. The next morning, Lucy disappeared, taking her belongings. Dad merely sighed with relief and muttered that a sick mind never rests. As for me, I was happy to regain the former coziness and harmony in our home. From then on, there was no room for arrogance and venomous disposition in our lives. Only the bond between Dad and I, unbreakable and priceless, like in those distant times. We regained peace and soul comfort within our hallowed walls after so many months of torment. And I vowed to myself that I would never again allow anyone to disrupt our fragile family happiness. We had endured too much to lose it again.